I did not cry. I did not argue. I just stood in the parking lot of my daughter's apartment complex, watching her bedroom light through the blinds, and I thought about the $200 I'd spent on gas to get there. Then I got back in my truck and drove home. That was a Thursday. By Saturday morning, I had 26 missed calls. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but what matters is that I raised my daughter alone. Her mother, Judith, passed from ovarian cancer when my daughter, I'll call her my girl, because that's what she's always been to me, was 11 years old. 11. We buried Judith in October, and by Thanksgiving, it was just the two of us sitting at a folding table in the kitchen, because I hadn't had the heart to unfold the big dining table that fits 6. We ate turkey sandwiches and watched football. She fell asleep on my shoulder. I didn't move for 3 hours because I didn't want to wake her. That's the father I was. I worked 31 years as a pipe fitter for a commercial contractor out of Columbus, Ohio. Unglamorous work. I came home with grease under my fingernails and a bad knee by my mid-40s. But I put money away. I was careful. Judith had always said, "Don't be the kind of man who lets his family scramble." So I didn't scramble. I saved. When my daughter was in high school, she was sharp, funny. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which I told her was actually a gift, even when it drove me insane. She got a partial scholarship to Ohio State. I covered the rest. About $14,000 a year out of my own pocket for 4 years. I never mentioned the number to her. It wasn't a loan. It was just what you do. She met her husband, Thad, her junior year. Thad came from money, or at least he talked like he did. His family was from the north side of Cincinnati, and they had a way of making you feel like you tracked mud on their carpet even when you were standing outside. First time I met him, he looked at my truck, a 2009 F-150 with a dent in the passenger door, and said, "Oh, that's a workhorse, huh?" The way he said workhorse told me everything. But my daughter loved him, so I shook his hand and smiled. After the wedding, which I paid $22,000 toward, because Thad's parents contributed what they called their emotional support, and apparently that doesn't come with a check, the two of them moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. Thad had gotten a job in financial advising. My daughter got a position at a marketing firm downtown. They were doing well. I was proud of them. I visited twice a year, Christmas and summer. That was the arrangement, and I was fine with it. I'd fly down, stay at whatever hotel was nearby, and we'd spend the long weekends together. I'd take them to dinner. I'd help around the apartment, fix things, carry things, the kind of dad stuff I'd always done. And then I'd fly home and miss them both until the next visit. 2 years into their marriage, my daughter called me with news that made me sit down on my porch steps and just put my hand over my heart. She was pregnant. I drove down to Charlotte that weekend. I brought the crib that had been in my garage since she was born. Judith's mother had given it to us, painted white, solid oak. My daughter cried when she saw it. Even Thad seemed moved, which was rare for him. I spent Saturday assembling it in their second bedroom, while Thad watched a college football game in the other room. I didn't mind. I was putting together a crib for my grandchild. I would have done it in the rain. My grandson Elliot was born the following June. 6 pounds, 14 ounces. Red face, black hair, the loudest set of lungs I'd ever heard in my life. I was in the waiting room when the nurse came out and said, "You can come back now." I walked into that room and my daughter was holding him, exhausted, beautiful, and she looked at me and said, "Dad, come meet him." I held Elliot for the first time and I thought about Judith, about how she never got to be a grandmother. I didn't say that out loud. Some grief you just carry quietly. Over the next 3 years, I helped with Elliot more than most grandparents do. My daughter went back to work full-time after 12 weeks, and childcare in Charlotte was expensive, nearly $1,800 a month for the center they wanted. I offered to cover it. I told them to put the money toward their mortgage instead. So every month, I transferred $1,800 directly to my daughter's account. That was $1,800 a month, for 2 years and 4 months. Thad started doing well at his firm. They upgraded apartments, then they bought a house in a nicer neighborhood. A 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb called Ballantyne, with a yard and a 2-car garage. I went down for the housewarming. I brought a bottle of wine and a new set of Craftsman tools for the garage. Thad thanked me in the way he thanked people. A nod, a half smile, like you just handed him something he already expected to receive. My daughter was happy, though. That's what I told myself in the car on the way to the airport. She's happy. The calls started becoming shorter, then less frequent. I told myself it was life. They were busy. Elliot was in preschool now. Thad had his work dinners and his golf weekends. I kept sending my regular money. I visited at Christmas, stayed at a Marriott about 4 miles from their house. Last December was when everything changed. I told my daughter in October that I was planning my usual Christmas trip. She'd said, "Yeah, of course, Dad," the same way she always said it. I booked the flight, booked the hotel, took the week off from the part-time consulting work I'd picked up since retirement. I landed in Charlotte on December 22nd. I texted her from the airport. No response. I texted again from the rental car. She replied about an hour later, "Hey Dad, we've got a lot going on this week. We'll figure out timing." We'll figure out timing. I've flown 400 miles. I told myself it was fine, they were busy. The holidays were hectic. I checked into my hotel, ordered room service, and watched a History Channel documentary about the Transcontinental Railroad until I fell asleep. The next morning, I drove to their house. December 23rd. I brought a bag of gifts, books for Elliot, a kitchen thing my daughter had mentioned wanting, a nice bottle of scotch for Thad. I pulled into the driveway and rang the doorbell. My son-in-law answered the door. He was dressed well. Behind him, through the entryway, I could see people, a dozen, maybe more, laughter, Christmas music, a table laid out with food. He looked at me the way you look at someone who shows up to the wrong address. "Oh," he said. "Walter." "Not come in. Not we weren't sure you were coming by today. Just, oh, Walter." I said, "Merry Christmas, Thad. I brought some things for the family." He stepped halfway out the door and pulled it close behind him, like he was shielding the party from me. He said, in a low voice, "This isn't really a great time. We've got Cassandra's family here. It's a whole thing. I thought Cassandra told you." I looked at him. I said, "Cassandra didn't tell me anything." He did that thing with his jaw, that shifting thing. Then he said, "Well, we assumed you'd understand. Maybe swing by on the 26th or something." The 26th. I'd already bought a non-refundable return ticket for the 25th. I stood there, on my daughter's porch, in the cold, holding a bag of Christmas gifts for my grandson who was somewhere inside that warm house, and I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just said, "Okay, tell her I stopped by." I handed him the bag of gifts. He took it without looking inside. I walked back to my rental car. I sat in that car for about 5 minutes. The temperature outside was 38 degrees. I could see the lights through their front window. Then I drove back to the Marriott. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in that hotel bed, and I thought about Judith. I thought about Elliot, who was 3 years old and inside that house not knowing his grandfather was sitting in a parking lot 4 miles away. I thought about 31 years of grease under my fingernails. I thought about $1,800 a month. I'm a quiet man. I've always been a quiet man. The people who know me well know that quiet doesn't mean passive. Judith knew that. She used to say, "Walter's quiet until he isn't." She said it with affection. I wasn't angry on the drive home. I was clear, there's a difference. Anger is hot and disorganized. What I felt was clear, the particular clarity you get when the fog burns off and you see something exactly as it is. I flew home on Christmas Day. I sat in the middle seat on a Delta flight eating a bag of pretzels, and I looked out the window at the clouds below us, and I thought about what I needed to do. The first thing I did when I got home was call my bank. I had set up an automatic transfer years ago. The $1,800 a month for childcare. The childcare costs had ended about 8 months prior when Elliot started kindergarten, but I had never stopped the transfer. I hadn't thought about it much. The money just went. I hadn't asked for gratitude. I just hadn't turned off the faucet. I turned it off. Then I opened my laptop and looked at the other thing. The thing I'd been doing quietly for the last year that my daughter and son-in-law didn't know about. When they'd bought the Ballantyne house 2 years ago, they'd come up short on the down payment. My daughter had called me, nervous, and asked if I could help. The house was $490,000. They needed $30,000 more to make the numbers work. I'd wired it over within 48 hours. No paperwork, no interest. Just a father helping his daughter get into the home she wanted. What I'd done 6 months later, quietly and without telling anyone, was consult a real estate attorney here in Columbus. I'd had a lien recorded on the property. Informal but documented, acknowledging the $30,000 as a personal loan. My attorney had said it was the prudent thing to do. I'd said I hoped never to use it. I called my attorney the morning of December 26th. She picked up on the second ring, which I appreciated, it being the day after Christmas. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll prepare the demand letter." I said, "Give them 30 days." In January, my son-in-law called me for the first time in 4 months. He was calm on the surface in the way that people are calm when they're trying not to panic. He said there must be some kind of misunderstanding with the bank, that the transfers had stopped and they were counting on that money. I told him that Elliot had been in kindergarten since September, and the arrangement had been for childcare costs specifically. He said that wasn't how he remembered it. I said, "I have the email, Thad, from when we set it up." He shifted gears, came friendlier, asked how I was doing, how the drive back had been, asked if I'd had a good Christmas. I thought about that question for a moment before I answered it. Then I said, "I had a quiet one." My daughter called the following week. She was upset, but not at Thad, at me. She said I was being childish. She said I was using money to punish them for a scheduling miscommunication. She said the word miscommunication 3 times. I counted. I asked her one question. I said, "Did you know I was coming to Charlotte?" She was quiet. I said, "Did you know Thad turned me away on the porch?" More quiet. I said, "Okay," and I let the silence sit there. She cried. I didn't hang up. I stayed on the line and let her cry because she was still my daughter, and crying deserved a witness. But I didn't apologize. I didn't say it would all go back to normal, because I had decided that normal was actually the problem. The demand letter arrived at their house in the second week of January. My attorney had done it correctly. 30 days to arrange repayment or acknowledgement of the debt, or we would pursue legal remedies available under Ohio and North Carolina reciprocal statutes. That was when Thad called my cell phone 4 times in one afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. His messages went from reasonable to irritated to quietly threatening in about 2 hours. The last message said something about how I was destroying the family over a misunderstanding, and that he had friends in the financial industry who could make things complicated for me. I forwarded that voicemail to my attorney. She said, "This is actually helpful." What happened next I learned partly from my daughter and partly from court documents that became public record. Thad had debts I didn't know about. Not mortgage debt, personal debt. He had taken out a home equity line of credit on the Ballantyne house, $65,000, without telling my daughter. The money had gone to cover losses from investments he'd made through his own brokerage accounts. Investments that his clients at the firm did not know he'd essentially replicated using firm resources. That's a phrase with a very specific legal meaning. The firm found out in February. I wasn't involved in that. I want to be clear about that. I had done one thing. I had stopped a bank transfer and sent a demand letter. The rest was architecture that Thad had built himself, and it had been standing on a weak foundation long before I came along. He was terminated in February. Regulatory review began in March. By April, the process that would ultimately lead to a settlement with the State Securities Commission was underway. I won't go into all the details because some of them are still being resolved, but the short version is that the word my attorney used was restitution. My daughter called me on a Tuesday morning in March. She called from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't pick up. When I heard her voice, it sounded different. Not the upset voice from January. Not the performing voice she'd used at Thad's family dinners. Just her voice, the way she sounded when she was 11 years old and needed something and didn't know how to ask. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you some things." She told me about the HELOC. She told me she'd found statements she hadn't seen before. She told me she didn't know, and I believe her. I do believe her about the extent of what Thad had been doing. She'd known he was stressed. She hadn't known why. She told me she was scared. I said, "I know." She asked if I hated her. I said, "I've never hated you, not for one day." She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I'm sorry about Christmas." I said, "I know that too." She and Elliot came to stay with me for 3 weeks in April while things were being sorted out in Charlotte. I made up the guest room with the good blankets. I bought the cereal Elliot liked, the one with the honey clusters, and I put it on the second shelf so he could reach it himself. He was 5 now, sturdy and curious, and he liked to follow me around the house, asking questions about how things worked. Why does the furnace make that sound? What are all those tools in the garage? Can I help? One afternoon, I got the old crib down from the attic, still solid, still good, and we looked at it together, me and Elliot, this piece of furniture that had helped 3 generations. He ran his hands along the oak rails. He said, "Grandpa, is this really old?" I said, "It's older than your mom." He thought about that with the gravity that 5-year-olds apply to important information. Then he said, "It's still good, though." I said, "Yeah, it's still good." The financial situation took several months to fully resolve. The $30,000 I was owed came back to me through the settlement process. Not all at once, but it came back. The Ballantyne house was listed in May. My daughter found a smaller place to rent in a suburb north of Charlotte near a good school district. And she's building things back the way you build things when you've lost some of what you had. Carefully, without much margin for waste. I still transfer money to my daughter every month. A different amount now, smaller, and we talked about it openly before I started. What it was for, how long, what it wasn't. She said she didn't want me to feel like she was using me. I told her I'd spent 30 years learning the difference between being used and choosing to give, and I knew which one this was. Thad is not in the picture the way he was. I won't say more than that because Elliot is 5 years old and will one day have to make his own sense of who his father is. I won't be the one to build that story for him. I'll just be here. I am 63 years old. My knee still bothers me in the cold. I drive the same truck, dent in the passenger door, 180,000 miles on it now, and running fine. I watch football on Sundays, and I keep Judith's photo on the mantel, and I keep the second shelf stocked with Honey Cluster cereal for when Elliot visits. Last month, he called me on the phone all by himself. His mother helped him dial, but he did the talking, and he said, "Grandpa, what are you doing?" I said, "Just sitting on the porch." He said, "Is it cold?" I said, "A little." He said, "You should get a blanket." I laughed. I told him that was good advice. I told him I'd do that. I went inside and got a blanket and sat back down on the porch and looked at the yard, the same yard where I'd pushed my daughter on a swing 30 years ago, and I thought about how strange and long and sometimes brutal the road is between those two moments and how you don't get to skip any of it. You just have to stay. You just have to keep showing up, even when they close the door, especially then. I didn't need 26 missed calls to know my daughter loved me. But I'll admit, I let them ring, all 26 of them. I sat in my living room and I watched the phone light up and I thought about a parking lot in Charlotte and a porch light through the blinds, and then I picked up on the 27th call and I said, "Hey, sweetheart, I'm here." I've thought a lot about that parking lot, the 38-degree air, the lights through the window, the bag of gifts Thad took without looking inside. People ask me sometimes, not directly, but in the way people circle around a thing, whether I regret how I handled it, whether I was too hard, whether a father should just absorb whatever his children do and keep showing up with a smile and a check and no conditions. I understand why they ask. I used to believe that myself. I thought unconditional love meant unconditional tolerance. I've learned those are not the same thing. What I did wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. I stopped a bank transfer I should have stopped 8 months earlier, and I enforced a loan agreement my attorney had recommended when the ink was still fresh. That's not punishment. That's just a man deciding to stop pretending that a one-sided arrangement was actually a relationship. Here's what I've come to understand about how life tends to work, not in a mystical sense, but in the plain, observable way that causes and effects accumulate over time. The choices Thad made, the HELOC, the firm's resources, the quiet architecture of a life built on other people's trust, those didn't collapse because I stopped a wire transfer. They collapsed because they were already hollow. I just stopped being one of the walls holding the structure up. What falls when you remove a false support was never really standing. My daughter is a good person who made the mistake that good people sometimes make, which is letting someone else's version of the world slowly replace their own. That takes time to undo. It takes honesty, and honesty is uncomfortable, and most of us avoid it until we can't anymore. She couldn't anymore. And when she called me from that number I almost didn't recognize, with that voice I hadn't heard since she was 11 years old, I knew the real work was just beginning. Not the legal work. The human work. Elliot asked me once why I keep Judith's photo on the mantle. I told him that's where she belongs. He thought about it and said, "So she can see the living room." I said yes. Exactly that. I'm 63. My knee aches. The truck has 180,000 miles on it, and I'm not replacing it. And some mornings I sit on the porch with a blanket, because a 5-year-old told me to. And I think about what I actually passed on to my daughter. Not the money, not the down payment or the child care or the college tuition. I mean the thing underneath all of that, the willingness to do hard things quietly, the understanding that real strength isn't making noise, it's making decisions, the refusal to collapse under circumstances that are genuinely painful. Those are the things I got from Judith, and from 31 years of unglamorous work, and from every morning I got up and kept going when keeping going was the only option available. That's what I hope Elliot sees when he follows me around the garage asking how things work. Not a man who won, just a man who stayed. That's enough. I think that's always been enough.